Hey, everybody, this is Barry Mankin here with the Holistic Home Health Podcast here in Nashville, Tennessee. We're going to talk about some limitations, if you will. Everybody asks us here whenever we're doing environmental inspections about what our process looks like, all the different modalities or different ways that we do investigations to look for whether it's mold or any other contaminant in the home. And I would like to, nobody talks about the limitations. And since Clint Eastwood is probably the best known philosopher on the planet, at least that's our the way we think of things. That's kind of our motto, is to know our limitations, right? So that way we can learn, and it gives a gap to say, all right, we set expectations well with the client, and we also know what to expect out of what we're doing. So it goes to value. It goes to trying to get that scientific process defined whenever we're trying to investigate, where things come from, whether it's a smell, whether it's moisture, whether it's mold, whether it's combustion, VOCs, you name it. So let's talk about some of the instruments that we use, or some of the methods that we use whenever somebody is hiring somebody like me to come and look at their house, and we set those expectations. There's a lot of forums online. It drives me crazy. One of the reasons why we're doing this. A lot of forums online where everybody has their experience, and we talk about this a lot. And everybody's experiences, I believe, are valuable to them. But the caution is to make sure that we're not making one experience for one person or somebody's diagnostic process that may be limited from an industry such as HVAC or even construction alone, to be the only way to get to solutions. Because at the end of the day, a good diagnostic is what you need to be able to validate your process for a prescription, if you will. So if you don't have that process in place, we always say that's malpractice, just like the medical industry. So we're going to talk about that with our next interview here coming up soon. But as it relates to limitations, let's talk about sampling, for example, as it relates to mold. There's different ways to do that. And over the years, that process has changed with different types of instruments. And now, I would say the most common methods of retrieving, like sampling for mold, as an example, would be either tape sampling, swab sampling, or air sampling, or physical sampling of the actual bulk material. Those are kind of like the top methods that people use to identify concentrations and types of molds. So I'll try to run through this here real quick. So the tape sample is two-dimensional, right? And the tape on a surface, it's like three-dimensional, or it's soft, or it's the material itself is degrading. It may be harder to get a really clean look at the mold spores from the labs. So we want to get more of a flat surface for those types of, with maybe not as heavy of a debris when we're ever taking a sample. And we don't want to press that really hard and rub it around, So the idea is we just want to have a firm lift that's just gets the adhesion to the material, pulls it off. Otherwise, we could destroy those spores and smash them and turn into fragments everywhere, which is harder to identify. So they want to, actually see that fragment. So if you're in a wet area, if you're in, an area that is degraded or it's heavy debris, those are not ideal conditions for a tape sample, as an example. So it may not show a very accurate count or identify types of molds when you're in those situations. So knowing what type of sample to take, that has a limitation, right? So in those instances, it doesn't do a great job. Conversely, then on a swab sample, it has its limitation as well. So usually it's for those situations where you've got more saturation, you have a larger area. Ideally, you want to kind of get that, 10 centimeter square, if you will, but depending on what your scenario is, that may fluctuate. So it does really, really well at heavier debris, more wet surfaces, or surfaces that are more rough, or a cloth or something like that. So the idea is, when you're going to get more material, that works better. Now, it doesn't mean that it doesn't do well on two-dimensional, but you may miss some things because that swab is deep. It's not just a flat surface. So whatever might get in there may not be seen as easily in that process whenever they're looking at that particular swab under a microscope. So the limitation then would be if you have a clean surface and you swab that surface, it may not show up as anything when a two-dimensional might show something. So I hope you're getting the point here. There's a reason why we pick what we pick. It's not just random. Air sampling. This is the big controversy in mold, all right, all the time. We have the way we do our process, we value air sampling. And a lot of people online will talk about the limitations of that or the fact that it doesn't work at all, right? So I'm going to tell you that is baloney. So remember, air, which we've talked about before, air sampling is for suspended mold at certain concentrations and types, right? We want to just catch something if it's obvious. If something's obvious in the air or there's a hint of it in the air that we can extrapolate, that is an indicator for other things, or it tells us if the room is contaminated, right? So instead of again, back to limitations. As an example, if I have a surface over here and there's the mold spores, or this was recently cleaned, right? And we're just doing a random sample for no apparent reason, and we just want to check and see what's on a surface, and it's clean, you're not going to find something. But if the mold is over there, or the mold is in the air and it hasn't settled out, or we have a source coming from a certain location, right? So the limitations are between the air sampling, if it's suspended and not settled, and maybe the surface was recently cleaned, we may not catch it from a physical sample versus an air sample, and vice versa, right? So the mold is either suspended, it's settled, or it's hidden. And it could be wet too, to where it's sticky and it's not sporulating, not getting out into the air yet, depending on a lot of things. So knowing the limitation, the air sample itself doesn't catch necessarily a source unless certain conditions are allowing it to get into the air. And that source is either so apparent, or the air currents and the pressurization is drawing that in and the spores are releasing into the air, or there's history from previous remediation or previous activity where something was brought into the room. So there's lots of situations. I've had air sampling where I found Stachybotrys in a brand new house, right? And it was several counts in the air where it wasn't on surfaces, very clean house. Well, turns out there was something hidden and there were air currents, and it was a localized spot that nobody would have guessed. It didn't present itself yet. It was such a young leak or an acute area that hadn't presented itself, hadn't gotten worse yet. But the air currents and the pressure of the house, because it was a tight house, it was drawing it in from an outlet, and we could smell the MVOCs coming out of there. You could smell the mold. Well, that was localized to that area. The air sampling picked it up. Initially, I was thinking, well, did you have some painters in here? They brought a blanket, something like that. No, it was actually some hidden mold, but there were no indicators. That's where it's everybody's best guess, right? We start diagnosing things. We start getting a little deeper. And it was a very, very localized, hidden spot. But they had recent activity on the backside of this wall where they hung some stuff up and something pierced a sewer pipe. And other than the sewer smell itself, slight, it was mold. It was a combination of those things. But nobody would have known that. The wall looked fine. In the crawl space where we had access to it, it was only a localized area that big. But in that wall cavity, not so good, right? So it only takes a few days. So again, the limitation is it doesn't always tell us where the source is. We have to use our noggin. Sometimes we have to reassess these things. So it can get complicated. The other thing that we'll talk about, so that kind of gives you an understanding of some of those limitations, right? All have value, but all has a limitation. As it relates to talking about the next step would be moisture. If we're looking for moisture in different locations, usually we're going to do a moisture mapping scenario with infrared and a moisture meter. Now, here's the limitations of this. Infrared doesn't always mean moisture. It means air. It also means that we might not even see either one of those things if the temperature differential isn't there. So the limitation of infrared. If your temperature differential between your inside and outside is not very similar and not the same, so different times of the year, like spring and fall when everybody's just got their windows and doors open and you've got the same temperature inside and out, you're not going to see that temperature differential, right? We reach what's called equilibrium, just like we do with moisture in a house. Everything's trying to reach equilibrium. So you may not see something. So we try to pick our times, do different situations to kind of push that temperature differential, create things in those moments to be able to have a higher chance of seeing it with that diagnostic tool. But even if we see a thermal anomaly, in those cases, it may not even be moisture. So we check with a moisture meter, right? It kind of tells us where to check because you can be here and you can be here and you can have a whole lot of moisture and mold in one wall cavity and this wall cavity over here could be fine, right? So just within a few feet, that's going to change things. So the limitation, even with the moisture meter, is to say, somebody check the wall. So here's the limitations of a moisture meter. A, are you on a nail? Are you on some flashing? Is it actually water or not? So the corner beads of drywall, all of those will go off and give us a false positive. And is your, depending on your tool itself, is it updated, depending on how advanced it is? Has it had its recent update? Because some of them you actually have to plug in and do a download and update to. So it's, the more sophisticated moisture meters. Most of them, however, are going to pick up a signal within that wall cavity. But there's limitations on how deep it is too, right? So the depth of that read of that tool, you have to know your tool and what its limitations are to know what to expect from it. So you could have moisture on the backside of a wall and not presenting itself on the front side, depending on a lot of issues. You see how this gets complicated? So it's never just, oh, you did the thing. You did the moisture with the thingy, right? I hear that all the time. But knowing the limitations of those tools helps us do our diagnostic process better. And then it sets the expectation up because nothing is 100% with this. We're doing a scientific process and a diagnostic to try to get to a case, to build a case, to get to an end goal, to find root causes. So that kind of gives you a couple of examples with that. Air currents, back to air currents with that. An air current could mean moisture because we're in Tennessee, depending on the time of year, or it could just mean air, right? So again, knowing that that thermal anomaly is there, and if we see a square pattern or something to say, oh, that's just some missing insulation. What happens when you have a dew point against a cold surface or a hot, hot moist air, or the opposite, you have a warm surface and cold air, right? That dew point, depending on thermodynamics and how that's happening, depending on the time of year, what's going on with conditioning, you could still have condensation creating. I just was on an inspection today where we had that historically inside an interstitial wall cavity on an interior wall. And it's full of mold in there because of the way the air currents were drawing something in. There's no other reason. There wasn't a leak. And it wasn't wet at the time of the inspection, right? It has history, and then it goes dormant, and then it has history, and then it goes dormant. So again, right, active mold versus dormant mold, that whole scenario gets a little complicated, but knowing the limitations of why we're doing what we're doing, trust your environmentalists. If you've done your research to hire the right person, trust their process. And it doesn't mean they're perfect, but we do this every day. We keep these things in mind. So the idea is, as long as we understand the limitations and you understand some of the limitations for the expectation part of it, we should be able to get there quicker, right? And sometimes we need to say, okay, the budget may be a limitation. We may need more data to be able to be more concrete. No different than when you're, going to the doctor and they say, well, we've got blood work, but we don't have this. We need an EKG, or we need, whatever diagnostic process. Everything points and has its own vantage point and points to something. But the limitation of that only gives you the parameters of that information. And it may help support something or refute something. So again, we have to take everything with a grain of salt here. So I hope that helps to put things in context. Mold dogs. We talked about, we did a whole thing on mold dogs. If you're going to, I'm not a fan of them, but if you're going to use that, I think there's a better method, which we happen to have. But B, they don't tell you what it is. They don't tell you how bad it is. They don't tell you what type it is. They sit there and wag their tail and you put a piece of blue tape down there and maybe it's something you have to remediate, or maybe it's just some cladosporium that happens naturally all the time and you got a little bit of mold that's that big. Or maybe it's trapped and wet and it's not off-gassing. You're not getting any of the beta-glucans coming out of there that they're trying to smell because they're not smelling necessarily the mold specific. Sometimes they're smelling the byproduct of the mold. So you have to, again, know the limitations of your process, and in this case, the dog. There is no silver bullet to this, okay? We say that a lot. I hope you're getting the picture because, again, it sets the expectations up. Most of the time, and all of these different modalities that people use are different ways to look for mold. It's usually in the hands of the wrong person, and they don't know their limitations, which is why, again, Clint Eastwood is the man. When you have a home inspector and they do 2 air samples inside and 1 outside for a control, here's the limitation of that. A, you're not covering the house from a square footage standpoint. You're not going to get a baseline of what's just in the air at that moment. And anybody says that the house is clear of mold is lying, or they don't know what they're talking about. So the limitation of that is A, you're not getting the whole house covered. B, probably they don't even know why they're doing it, where to do it, what the height requirement is so that you're in the breathing space, how to disturb air to create something to get to your sample. So again, it's just a quick picture And the less effort you put in it, the less knowledge to maximize that process within its own limitations, you're going to get what you get. Outside of the limitation of interpreting any lab results that come in. Most people don't know how to do that, don't know what certain molds mean, don't know what is a healthy level, what's a non-healthy level, what's the difference between a healthy level for a sensitized individual versus normal, right? So, and understanding our climate with that as well, and our location geographically, which the guys from out of town have their limitations. They don't know our climate. They don't know how HVAC works in a moist climate like this. Most of them don't even know mechanical, HVAC issues, which is the big wild card in this whole thing. So again, limitations. Everything has a limitation. We were discussing before. We were discussing, the stuff with the dogs, the Instascope that we have. We did a whole segment on that. The Instascope, as cool of a diagnostic tool as it is, and it is like nothing does what it does, right? It's amazing. However, has its limitations. So I can see total biological load in a room live. And when I say that, I mean it can hunt and tell me exactly what's in something, what's on something as it relates to categories. So it'll give me mold, it'll give me allergens, it'll give me viral content, it'll give me fungal, it'll give me TVOCs, and it'll give me carbon dioxide levels live in any space as I go through a room. So I can hunt for an anomaly, much like infrared, but as a different diagnostic. What it doesn't do is tell me specifically, I'll get a range. We got PM 2.5, we got humidity, temperature, all that stuff too. But it doesn't tell me type and concentration as it relates to mold or bacteria for that matter, which it sees the bacterial. So, but it'll show me an overall load and identify that category. Basically, it's great at identifying where to take a sample, but it doesn't tell me specifically what it is. Then we have a reason to take a sample. So it has its own limitation. Very, very valuable tool, but is it a reason to take a sample or not? That depends on the item. It depends on the scenario, the moisture content, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? Then we get into looking at, and I'm sure we're not going to get all this in today, but then we're going to look at even VOCs. Let's go the other side. We've talked about mold enough. On the VOC side, we're going to talk about what types of tools we use for that. Most of the time, we're going to do either a sorbent tube or we're going to do some live readings with our Gray Wolf. Gray Wolf is just a brand name for a tool that gives us live readings of certain contaminants as it relates to gases and TVOCs in the air. So it helps identify those compounds to a point. So when we're dealing with smells, when we're dealing with formaldehyde, when we're dealing with ozone, right? Oxygen, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and any of these other types of contaminants, there's what I should say, there's healthy levels, right, that the EPA or World Health Organization kind of designate as okay. I kind of treat a lot of that stuff like radon. There's no healthy level of radon. A radon tool itself has its limitations. We'll talk about that next. But you're not going to get every compound identified. You're going to get a panel. That panel has a limitation. Your smell or your compound may not be on there, but the idea is we're going to identify categories of compounds those compounds can be further broken down into subcategories. And then maybe we go, aha, that's what comes from now. What materials are in here that have those compounds? That's where it gets really fun. So you're either hunting and sniffing, or you're, again, using your noggin, right? I had one person that had a plant that was at a window that was a fake plant, and the sun was hitting it at certain times of the day. They had these smells. They thought it was mold. We ruled that it wasn't mold because, again, smells are kind of deceptive. And it was VOCs. It was off-gassing from this plastic tree. Well, what happens is, the mold didn't catch it because it wasn't biological, right? But if we would have had our sorbent tube or our gas meter, the gas meter, I could have either brought air into a gas meter, which is one way to do it, but you're only going to get specific compounds that it is calibrated to look for, or another meter that can sense, it's got its own sensors inside of it, and you can see things live with that, with the digital screen as well. So there's different ways to grab air or just view what air comes in contact with the machine. And those compounds can be further identified within the limitations of your instrument. So it's better than not doing it, but it doesn't mean that you're going to catch every compound. I hope that makes sense. A sorbent tube itself, whenever we're doing a grab, we're going to have a time limit, and it's going to be that time of day. Is whatever is off-gassing a common thing, you're going to grab that sample, you're going to send that out to the lab. They're going to identify those compounds within that tube. So it's not necessarily live, but you have a certain amount of time to get a grab, much like a mold sample. So the limitations of that are, again, is that panel that we're paying for from the lab going to identify the compounds that we have? And then B, is it enough to identify what is in that room or what's influencing that room from another location, right? So it's a hunting expedition in a lot of cases. We'll shoot with radon real quick, and then I just want to touch on these limitations. So radon, we're looking for radon decay particles, and typically anymore, most people are using a continuous radon monitor where we're going to do like a short-term test. Anything beyond that's like an EPERM test, which has a better average. But we're looking for averages of radon decay particles that we're going to be exposed to. Exposure is everything, right, as it relates to your health. But when we're talking about those limitations, it's the pressure of the house that given day. If it rains the next day, the radon levels are going to go up because it's coming out of the ground, right? So if it's a real estate transaction or whatever the case is, you're only looking at a 52-hour test for that moment in time. It is a picture. But the house is always changing. The pressure is always changing. You have basic construction methods that has, again, its own set of limitations on what it can be exposed to or what it could hold as it relates to contaminants. But the idea is whatever's coming from the outside that's going to influence, we need to be able to measure effectively. But that next month, that may change. We had a call today from an insurance company was requiring quarterly measurements, which is smart as it relates to getting a good average, an annual average, and knowing the exposure rate for the inhabitants of these buildings. I think that should happen all the time, honestly, because I'm a little biased because I do the testing. But but the idea is if you're only getting a snapshot in time, and we have seasonal changes that affect the pressurization and the air currents in the house and how radon affects that area, the limitation is we don't see that the rest of the year. So again, when we check a box, especially like real estate industry, or we just want to say, the spouse is nagging about this, and we check that box, or we had remediation done, right? Unless you have numbers don't lie, but you also have to understand the limitations of the instruments that you're using. So again, just be aware that this is a process. Sometimes we have to reassess whenever we get things to a point. And if you go to your doctor and say, "Hey, we are still experiencing some symptoms, or I'm just not feeling well still," we may need to reassess some of these things or look in a different direction. So, again, sometimes this can be a process. And you've seen some testimonials. You understand, for some people that are sensitized, especially, this process isn't, like a normal house. Sometimes we have to get the house super clean and be very specific. So 30% roughly of the population are now sensitized to some level of chronic inflammatory response related to building illness. So I just want to make you aware that we have to know the limitations of all of these different diagnostics so that we can, and solutions, so that we can understand what to expect out of these things. And then that'll help this process as far as the emotional roller coaster that a lot of people are on. And if you can get somebody that's good, that can help you through this, hold your hand, if you will, through this process, you're going to get there a lot quicker. Okay. Hopefully all that helps. Thank you, Clint Eastwood, for the best philosophy on the planet. All right. Know your limitations. Have a good one.